What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at character creation in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous in beta at the moment. This isn't meant to be like some super specific in-depth look at every class and mechanic, that kind of thing. I just want to show everybody what is available in character creation to do and maybe familiarize new players with like some of the races and classes and stuff that'll be coming. Again, not trying to give like super specific guide to any particular best way to do anything. Just want to show as many people as possible as much of this beta as I can show them. With that in mind, here is character creation. So we start in our portrait screen. If you are unaware, most CRPGs will actually let you add portraits. These are just all of the base ones. But if you were to go find the portrait folder, it's usually just called portrait in the game files, you can just add pictures to that to use as portraits. If you ever look up any CRPG and they're using a portrait that clearly doesn't belong, that's usually why. It's not like a mod or anything. You can just put pictures in there to use. That brings us to our very long list of classes for Wrath of the Righteous. So, going over each and every single one of these is fine. However, I'm not going to go over every single subtype or subclass, whatever you want to call it, simply because I would be here all day. Most of them are returning from Kingmaker, but there are quite a few new ones. Also, some new prestige classes down at the bottom. So real quick, all of the ones that I can select from right now are just regular old classes you can pick. Down at the bottom, all of these are prestige classes. What that means is they are classes that require points in other classes. These are like inherently kind of, not exactly multi-class, because they don't necessarily have to be multi-class. It's just that they require specific prerequisites before you can put any points into them as you level up. Because each level, you'll be given a point to put into one of these classes. Now, most people are just going to put all their points into the same class every level. But if you want a multi-class, you can just put points into various classes, and thus, you're multi-classing. Now, the prestige classes are essentially the same thing as that. However, again, they have prerequisites. As you can see here, Duelist has all of those mobility, dodge, weapon finesse, combat mobility, as well as a base attack bonus that you have to meet before you're allowed to put any points in it. Now, Assassin is actually a super easy one to do. You just have to be playing a evil character, as well as have 5 in stealth, and that's all you've got to do. And then congratulations, you've got access to your sneak attack and stuff. Now, I want to point out that the prestige classes, even if you have them highlighted, for whatever reason, the character sheet does not seem to be ready to go, which is a great time to mention, everything you see here is not everything that is going to be in the game. Character creation is a work in progress, as I hopefully remembered to put a warning up at the beginning of the video about how this isn't done. It's a work in progress. Most of it is here, but the thing that we're going to see the least of is appearance stuff. Very little of the appearance stuff is done. Some of it is, a lot of it is missing. Alchemist is pretty straightforward. They experiment with poisons and things like that, and they throw them at people. 6 subclasses for that. All the subclasses do for every class is simply change the mechanics of it ever so slightly, or have you specialize in something. Like Chirurgeon is an alchemist who uses their ability with poisons and throwables and stuff like that to heal instead of deal damage. Then we have the Arcanist, which is just one of the many types of casters in the game. There are 4 separate subclasses. Arcanists are people trying to bend magic to their will with science and things like that, so just kind of keep that in mind. Barbarians, I think everyone pretty much knows what a barbarian is. They've got 5 subclasses they can go through. They get to pick a bunch of rage powers as they level up. They're pretty neat. Bard, 6 subclasses. They get various songs they can sing throughout combat that will have various effects on the party. They are great support classes. We have our Blood Rager. Blood Ragers are very similar to Barbarians in that they get a rage, but whereas a Barbarian gets rage powers, Blood Ragers can rage, but instead of a rage power, they get a bloodline where they get their rage from. Then we have Cavaliers. Cavaliers are warriors who try to perfect their art, as it says, but most importantly, all of these guys come with a mount, which is very important if you want to engage in the mounted combat that will be coming to the game, which is pretty cool. Or at least I hope it is, because it's not actually ready to go yet, hence why I haven't shown it to anybody. Eventually, mounted combat will be hopefully in working order, and this will make that an incredibly cool class, I think. Then we have Cleric. 5 separate subsets of Cleric. Clerics are a devotee to a god, and that god has granted them powers in return. Then we have Druids. Druids, in the most simplest way I can put it, worship nature in all of its various forms. They have a connection with nature, obviously, but it's also worth noting that Druids cannot wear metal armor. So keep that in mind. Then we have a fighter. Not much to say about a fighter. They are a fighter. All the various forms of fighting are pretty much covered here. They tend to specialize in any kind of weapon you want, really. So it's kind of just like the default class if you just want to hit something. Then we have hunters. Hunters come with an animal companion, which is their main feature. And they are capable of casting some spells as well to magically improve themselves, which is pretty neat. Then we have Inquisitor. So Inquisitors tend to track down enemies of their faith or their god. So that can come in various forms. Basically, the only real restriction for this class is they can't be an atheist. They do have to worship something. They do get spells and stuff. They are what is called a divine caster, which means they use their wisdom score to give themselves certain spell slots and stuff. And then they'll learn spells as they level up that they can use their divine spell slots to cast. Now, the difference with Inquisitors and divine spell casting is that you don't need to prepare divine spells. You just know them, and you expend spell slots to use any of them. Now, that brings us to Kineticist. They are kind of like elementalists in a lot of ways. They channel a particular chosen element or a favored element, and that can come in a lot of different ways. Some of them are actually martial warriors as well, if you pick like a kinetic knight. They're pretty cool. They operate on what is called burn, so they can increase the power of their elemental powers by accepting burn, which is a like physical exhaustion in a way. And that maxes out at a certain point, at which case they'll only be able to use super base level stuff. But Kineticists are very wide-ranging. They use elemental magic, so basically it's a nice way to get past the armor class of enemies without actually having to use a regular caster, because Kineticists get blasts, so they don't use spell slots when they use them. Magus is simply like a battle mage is probably the best way to put it. They get spells and they know how to fight, so they can be a very versatile class. They can do a lot of stuff for you. Monks are interesting as well. They primarily are known for using unarmed attacks. However, they can use things like quarterstaffs as well. But it's worth noting that most of them are not allowed to wear armor without losing their AC bonus, which would be rough. Then we have the Oracles. Oracles are people who have been touched by a god's providence in some way, meaning that they've been chosen to do something, and even they might not know exactly what that is. It can mean a lot of things, but essentially they are spellcasters who can just do weird stuff with their oracle powers. Then we have Paladins. Paladins are one of those people who just, I don't think, really needs any explanation. Warriors in service to a divine being of some sort. Rangers, very similar to Hunters, but they are not guaranteed the animal companion by any means, and they are, typically speaking, not nearly as prone to magic as Hunters are. Hunters usually get more magic than the Rangers do. Then that brings us to another classic, Rogues. Rogues get sneak attacks, which will let them do extra damage to enemies that they catch off guard. They can pick a lot of things that help them do that. They can cast spells through various subclasses if you get things like Eldritch Scoundrel, etc. That brings us to Shaman. Shaman are, in Pathfinder, people who commune with the spirit world in various shapes and forms. Sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, sometimes to harm the spirits instead of help them. Could go either way, but that is what a shaman is. They do a lot of stuff and are overall pretty versatile, I would say. Skalds are pretty interesting. They're basically like if you want to play a bard but also be more of a warrior at the same time. Now, they don't get like the bardic songs and stuff like Inspire Courage and all that the actual bards get, but they get a lot of cool stuff to make up for it that helps them in melee. And then, for instance, in later levels, they can use like songs or whatever. Then that brings us to Slayers. Slayers are usually specialists in killing things, obviously. So whether that be spawn, for instance, or something like that. They do, interestingly enough, also get sneak attack because, again, they're in a weird way kind of like a mix between a rogue and a more traditional fighter. So kind of in between there. Then we have sorcerers, who are essentially just casters, but they get their power from a specific bloodline as opposed to anything else, or like just learning how to cast the magic, right? Then that brings us to war priests. So war priests are like the army of their chosen faith. Now, that can mean a lot of things, honestly, and in my opinion are very similar to Paladins, though functionally they are a little different and don't get the spells and things that a Paladin typically would. So, that brings us to Witch. Witches are interesting. They can get their power from a variety of sources. Some are bound by hags or turning into something else like a hag. Some went through some god-awful event and a deity involved themselves in it for some instance and chose to grant them powers. So witches come from just a variety of sources. And they get a bunch of hexes they can use in combat, which have a variety of effects that are usually just forms of other spells, to be honest. And then we have Wizard. I think Wizard is one of the classes, like I mentioned earlier, that is simply self-explanatory and doesn't really require much in the way of explanation. So then we have all our prestige classes, like I talked about early. There is Duelist, Mystic Theurge, Hell Knight Signifier, Hell Knight, Assassin, Eldritch Knight, Stalwart Defender, Student of War, Arcane Trickster, Dragon Disciple, and Aldori Swordlord. So the prestige classes aren't necessarily better than the regular classes, they're just different in various ways. Pick them if you want, they're interesting. So with that out of the way, that brings us to race selection. There are humans, elves, dwarves, gnomes, halflings, half-elves, half-orcs, Aasimar, tiefling, Oreads, Dampier, and Kitsune. Most of those are pretty self-explanatory. I just want to mention that there is a difference between a halfling and a gnome. And then an Aasimar is a being touched, typically human, touched by celestial forces, whereas a tiefling is someone with demonic background, which is basically the polar opposite of an Aasimar with a celestial background. Then we have Oreads. They are humans with a touch of elemental earth being somewhere in their history. Dampiers are the living children of vampires birthed by human females. They're actually very interesting because while they are technically alive, they are healed by negative energy and hurt by actual healing spells. So something to keep in mind there. And then we have the Kitsune, which are the foxfolk, who are known to change their shape. Mostly standard stuff there, male or female options, obviously. And then some of them, that is the Aasimar, the Tiefling, the Dampier, and the Kitsune will actually get to pick a heritage. So if you pick one of those races, all of them can pick a heritage, which will affect their racial stat point bonuses. Once that is out of the way, you get to choose your deity, if you have one, as well as various other class-specific things. There is a lot of deities to choose from. For the most part, I would recommend just going with the ones you like the most, or one whose alignment and domains line up with what you want your character to do. There is a lot of lore here because this is a deep, deep game in terms of lore. So just keep in mind, unless you're ready to really dig into what each of these gods are and make a super informed decision, just try to choose the one that you like the most. It's also worth noting that at the bottom, there are some that are specific for, I would assume, later in the game, as they are specific to the game. Something worth mentioning. This is where if you are getting an animal companion through your class, you will choose it. And then that brings us to our ability points. Most people get a 25 point buy system. Now keep in mind you can reduce stats to increase that should you so choose. This is also affected by your race and other things. For the most part though, it's self-explanatory stuff. Strength is strength, dex is dex, but if you highlight it and then move over, it will show you exactly what bonuses it gives to everything, what skills it affects. For instance, you can see wisdom affects lore nature, lore religion, as well as perception. It's also very important to know which ability point is important for your class, right? So they have these little green thumbs ups next to the recommended ones, but keep in mind that's not a super big deal. That said, for instance, the guy I have here is an Inquisitor, which means he's a divine spellcaster. More importantly, that he gets his spell slots through his wisdom score. Now, in theory, knowing that, you would want to put a bunch of points into wisdom to get more spell slots, but personally, I don't like to do that, because you can actually get more wisdom from just in-game items. There are a bunch of helm slots that give you up to +6 or +8 or something like that. Wisdom that you can get eventually in Pathfinder. Personally, I want this guy to be a ranger, because he's, going to have a bow or whatever. And then I would rather put all those points into, say, something like dexterity, and then fill out my wisdom later through items. So something to just keep in mind. Things like that. This is where you're going to want to kind of know what you want to do ahead of time. There is retraining in the game, so like don't be too afraid to make a mistake. If you go to the guy you can hire mercs from, they'll usually let you retrain once or twice if you have the options turned on in your menus. All right, and that brings us to skills. Now, every level you're going to be able to have a max rank value, which at level 1 is of course 1. Now, all of these pluses you see on the side, that is from how you distributed your ability points. So I'm getting a bunch from my dexterity as well as my racial bonus for being a specific type of ASMR. You can do these pretty much however you want. Personally, knowing what you want your character to do helps, of course, but also putting it into whatever you have the biggest bonuses for already is also a nice way to go. But keep in mind, you don't have to do that by any means. So maybe just kind of like know what you want to do with your character, and then putting a rank into it will actually give you a pretty big bonus on the first point that you put into it. And then after that, it's just like +1 values, that type of thing. That brings us to our feats. At that point, there are a bunch of feats. So this is where having some knowledge of Pathfinder ahead of time is actually going to help you out a lot. So I'm going to make this guy a marksman, right? Or just any guy who uses ranged combat. So personally, I like to start with point blank shot, for instance, because that will give me a better attack roll on enemies within 30 feet. But more importantly, it's the prerequisite to precise shot, which removes the negative roll of a character being like right next to me. I would actually have a terrible time with that in a bow. And the game knows that, and it takes that into account when I'm rolling my attack rolls. So because of that, I like to start with point blank shot and then get precise shot next to get rid of that penalty almost immediately. So my point here being simply that knowledge of the game is really going to help you out here. So the best thing you can do is brush up on Pathfinder feats. Pathfinder Kingmaker is a great place to start. Most of the feats here are in there as well. And then that brings us to something new for Wrath of the Righteous, not necessarily new in general. A lot of games have a background selection. We can pick our background or choose not to. You can choose none. However, you can choose a background or, where is your character from? This is going to affect various proficiencies for your character, like what kind of weapons you can use, what kind of armor you can use, that kind of thing. Or it can change the stat roll for something. So for instance, an acolyte will use her wisdom instead of charisma when attempting to persuade someone. So just a lot of little bonuses like that. But for the most part, it's just a background. So, make a background for your character, have some fun with it. And then we will be able to choose any spells associated with our class if we have any. So, if you don't get spells, obviously you wouldn't do this part, but if you do, you will. And then we pick our alignment. Now, this can potentially be locked by a class or like a deity that you've chosen to worship. For instance, this Inquisitor that I'm making right here has actually chosen to be in service to a deity that is an evil deity. So I can be neutral, or I can be lawful evil, neutral evil, or chaotic evil. I can't choose the other options because I couldn't be my class if I did. So naturally, we're going to go lawful evil because that's the way to go. And then that brings us to appearance. So again, all the appearance stuff is just not really ready. As you can see, there's just not a lot of choices. And even some of the ones that are here clearly aren't ready to go. So just something to keep in mind. Like there's some decent stuff, but for the most part, this stuff is not ready. After that point, we can of course pick our voice. In between none is where the female voices are, as you can see by the male and female icons. So you can kind of pick a voice that you want for your character that they'll talk in, and then you choose your name, and you're done. And then once all that is done, you will be given an overview of all your choices, basically just your character sheet that you can check to see if you need to make any changes, that kind of thing. So there you go, guys. There is character creation and what that is going to look like, as well as some of the new things added in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. I really hope you guys enjoyed it, and it shed some light on some characters you guys would like to make in the future when the game approaches its full release. So with all that in mind, thank you guys so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. The channel's growing all the time, so I can't thank you guys enough. But in the meantime, may you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.